Welcome everyone to the 7th episode in the Bunyoro series. My name is David Ibanda, and this is the podcast Those Who Came Before Us. We ended the last episode with the capture of Omukama Kabalega and his subsequent exile and death. In this episode, I'm going to talk about Bunyoro in the colonial era. What happened to this once mighty and ancient kingdom as it underwent this transition into the modern world? It's interesting that the colonial era officially happened at the dawn of the new century. While such moments are usually looked at as the start of something new, or rather, a chance to start afresh, the 1900s opened with them stuck at rock bottom. They lost the war, lost their king, and were about to lose their way of life. But they did not go quietly into the good night, because I'm also going to talk about the Nyangire Rebellion of 1907. After they lost the war, the British incorporated them into what was at the time the Uganda Protectorate. But first, the Bunyoro were to be severely punished for their resistance. While Bunyoro was fighting off their invaders, the other kingdoms or groups agreed to work with the British. So this set them out to be perceived as the stubborn child that needed to be taught to respect them. But, as we know from before, Bunyoro's negative reputation was something that was long in the making. Their interactions with various explorers such as Samuel Baker, the Major of the Equatoria Empire, Charles Gordon, and the Italian explorer Gaetano Casati were unfortunately god-awful. Two of these people went on to convince the masses in Europe that Kabalega was a vile human being and hostile to foreigners. Of course, we know that these claims were overly exaggerated, but at the time, the British coming in believed every single word that they said about Bunyoro. They were seen as the center of Islam and the slave trade. They also feared that if they didn't do something about them, the Christian nation of Buganda would fall into the hands of the Mohammedan fanatics. Which, interestingly, Buganda ended up rebelling against them in the form of King Mwanga's uprising in 1898. However, the British were able to separate the actions of the king from those of his people. As such, the people of Buganda weren't punished for their late entry into the battle of resistance. In fact, they awarded them the highest status in the Uganda Protectorate. Many of the British considered them to be, quote-unquote, the most naturally civilized people of the region. Bunyoro, on the other hand, were not so lucky. They were branded a conquered people and were to be treated as such. Think Germany after World War I. Yeah, the unfair reparations they had to pay. Well, it was decided that Bunyoro and the other groups were to pay tribute to Buganda. But what distinguished Bunyoro from the rest was the fact that they had to pay way more than the others. And to rub salt in their wounds, part of their land was given to Buganda as payment for their involvement in the war. This actually had already been given to them in 1893 when Colonel Colville promised it to them. Unfortunately for the Baganda, he left for England due to illness before he could deliver. In 1896, Colville's replacement Berkeley fulfilled that promise and awarded Buganda what became the 6 lost counties of Bunyoro. The extent of the Buganda borders were finalized during the 1900 Buganda Agreement. This was a painful thing for Bunyoro to watch. It was an issue that took 68 years to rectify when they were finally restored to Bunyoro in 1964. Giving land to the Baganda was not the only way that the British humiliated the Bunyoro. First, all land in Bunyoro was deemed crown land, meaning it belonged to Her Majesty the Queen, that would be Queen Victoria, and at the time, later, King Edward. The rationale used was not only was it theirs by conquest, but that the Bunyoro weren't using it anyways. Bunyoro agents in Buganda cried hogwash. In a letter to the British government, they explained that the depopulation that happened in the last 10 years had given them the wrong impression. They had been subjected to genocide, scorched earth tactics, and it was no surprise that the population had drastically reduced. What was once a thickly populated country was now one hanging on for dear life. Reports show that in 1906, the Bunyoro had 8,572 births against 15,011 deaths. That's a massive disparity. So let's take a look at what was causing this. Apart from the obvious effects of the war, Bunyoro was continuing to experience a demographic crisis. As a matter of fact, it has been suggested that their numbers had been going down since the early 19th century. We know this from the writings of Eamon Pasha, who mentioned that most women in Bunyoro were barren. And in general, they had smaller families than the ones in Uganda. This was explained by the Bunyoro as a result of increased disease during the late 19th century. But there were also other factors, such as slavery by the Arabs in the Baganda. Certainly war with the Egyptians, slavers in the Baganda, would have interrupted natural births. In order to mitigate the situation, it was stated that Kabalega moved conquered peoples into central Bunyoro in order to increase the population. Despite this, most explorers did comment on how densely populated Bunyoro was. So from this, we can conclude that this wasn't alarming yet. But fast forward to the early 1900s, and we have a totally different situation. The British were genuinely worried that the Bunyoro were going to go extinct. The phrase, "everything that can go wrong will go wrong," applies here, due to the sheer number of threats to mortality that they were facing. They were dealing with widespread malnutrition, multiple disease outbreaks, not just for humans but for livestock as well. All things made worse by the punitive measures and general neglect of the colonial government. It's no surprise that the Bunyoro were experiencing extremely low levels of fertility. There's a lot here. So let's start with the livestock issue. Bunyoro was very much a cattle kingdom. If you've been listening to all the earlier episodes, you recall how I talked about how much they loved their cows. But by the 1860s, those cow numbers were very, very low. This was explained by disease outbreaks and the plundering that was done by Buganda. Now, those numbers did go up as the country became richer under Kabalega. It was stated that he had about 1,500 smooth, fat cows. These were actually part of his royal herd. The 1890s, however, saw an outbreak of rinderpest, which is a cow disease which tore through their herds at a fast rate. And of course, the wars of the period made things worse. The situation did not improve during the colonial period. They had the lowest numbers of livestock of any district in the Uganda Protectorate. The Bunyoro relied on cows for milk and meat. Now imagine when I tell you that by 1950, many Bunyoro had never tasted an ounce of meat or even a drop of milk. This explained the extremely low protein levels of the people. Many children had kwashiorkor, which was caused by a lack of protein. If you want to look up a picture of what somebody looks like with a disease, feel free to do so. This lack of protein caused reduced energy levels. Bunyoro were frequently described as wasting away and weak. Testicular atrophy was also observed in many of the men, which no doubt would have affected their fertility. For women, low protein intake caused underdeveloped or malformed pelvises. This put them at considerable risk of the children being stillbirths or the women dying during childbirth. Other meat sources were hard to come by. Fish was only eaten by lakeside communities such as at Lake Albert. Other livestock were low as well. Now I know you might be thinking, but David, surely they could get protein from other sources. They're vegetarians in this world. Vegans. Yes, I know. And I'm so glad you asked, young grasshopper. First, remember, milk was very important in Bunyoro society. Secondly, they could get proteins from other non-meat sources. They grew a variety of crops during pre-colonial times. However, the colonial period was different, and they were required to grow cash crops such as cotton and tobacco, which were incredibly difficult to grow. As such, they had very little time to cultivate their traditional crops. They were also forced to grow drought-resistant but less nutritious food crops like maize and cassava. The Bunyoro even described cassava as nyamirantyo, which means, "I'll just swallow," meaning that it was just there to fill the stomach and nothing else. It didn't even taste good. This misery of losing children to malnutrition led the Bunyoro to start giving their kids strange names that encapsulated their experience. An example would be Nyamayaro, which meant meat for death. They were saying that their children were just, at this point, food for death itself. Another one was Gafabusa, which meant waste of energy. Ndoleriire, meaning awaiting death. There were so many names like this. My God. It should be pointed out, though, that the colonial government did try to help. They set up measures in place that made it that no one died from starvation during famines. But that very policy also contributed to malnutrition since the crops they provided were not as nutritious as their traditional ones. Furthermore, Bunyoro was provided with hospitals to combat the many disease outbreaks. There was a sleeping sickness epidemic, a syphilis epidemic, malaria, smallpox, spirillum fever, river blindness. It's just, oh my God. Sleeping sickness was by far the worst one. It is also known otherwise as tripinal. Listen, I only know how to say this word one way, and that is the Ugandan way. I'm from Uganda, and I don't know what else to tell you, but this just rolls off the tongue better. So, trypanosomiasis is the disease which is otherwise known as sleeping sickness, because once you're infected, you do nothing but sleep. Now, of course, I'm not serious, but the disease is spread by tsetse flies and is called sleeping sickness because it affects people's sleep patterns. So one would have trouble sleeping during the night, but would sleep during the day. But that happens in the second stage. The first stage causes fever, headaches, itchiness, and swelling of the lymph nodes. It's a gnarly disease that affects both humans and animals, either domestic or wild. Now, the colonial administrator at the time by the name of Hesketh Bell saw this as another opportunity to rob the Bunyoro of their land. He earmarked large swaths of the country and claimed that they were sleeping sickness restricted areas. He then declared that people were to be removed off the land, which is an odd decision, given that Bunyoro had no fly belts. The tsetse flies were concentrated in patches close to lakes and rivers, not entire areas. The Bunyoro never lived close to open bodies of water. It had been the recent disruptions that had caused them to move to tsetse fly-infected areas for long periods of time. So why, oh why, would you eject people off the land? In fact, Bell purposefully ignored the recommendations of the principal medical officer, Dr. Hodges, which were to clear the bushes, which they were believed to be the habitats of the tsetse fly, in order to control the disease. It turns out that Bell wasn't partial to the idea of clearing bushes for a number of reasons. I already mentioned the need to possess the land for reserves. Another reason was that Bell believed that the project of clearing bushes would be too expensive. Nature had reclaimed so much of the land due to the reduced human population. Shane Doyle states that the early colonial government had a policy of being stingy with their money. And so with such a perspective, it's no wonder that Bell had hoped that by evacuating people, that in 3 years, he hoped they would be either cured or dead, thus saving his administration money. Now imagine his surprise when the medical measures at the time had succeeded in keeping those people alive. Dun, dun, dun. But of course, people still died in large numbers. The evacuations were a disaster. People were forcefully removed from their homes. Clans like the Wakwanga at Igisi Hill and the Babidrov Pajao never returned to their ancestral homelands. This move also allowed them to control some, like the Paluo people of northern Bunyoro. Colonial administrators hated the fact that they could just evade taxes by simply crossing the Nile. With the forced evacuation and resettlement, they were moved closer to the central where they could be put to work for food growing and labor work. So, what was this land used for? I'll give you a hint. Whenever you hear that someone went to Africa, there's a high chance that they went to see the animals. These animals are located on a game park or a national reserve in which they roam around unencumbered by the natives, all for your viewing pleasure. You see where I'm going with this, right? Of the 10 national parks in Uganda, 5 are located in what is and used to be Bunyoro territory. Hesketh Bell created wildlife estates out of these lands that were previously occupied by humans. The people being evicted didn't just lose their homes, but also farms, fertile soil, and fishing grounds. This triggered another famine in 1907, which the Bunyoro called Chiromere. To top it off, there was no compensation for those resettlements. Now, I know some of you might feel bad, but then, probably congratulate the efforts of conservation, but there is a tendency for the topic of conservation in Africa to be talked about like Africans didn't practice their own type of conservation. Think about it. How is it possible that the very people who lived with these animals on this land for centuries now had to be schooled on keeping said animals safe? According to historian Yolamu Nsamba, the Bunyoro practiced their own type of animal conservation. Let me break it down. Each Bunyoro belonged to a clan. Each clan has an animal totem. This could be a lion, leopard, antelope, elephant. You get the idea. If you belonged to the elephant clan, you were not allowed to eat it or hunt it. You protected it. It was a way of limiting who could go after a certain animal. Some, like the bushbuck, were protected by many clans. To clarify, I'm not disproving the value of animal reserves, but rather pointing out that this came at the expense of human lives. And this was somewhat of a feature of the colonial government's dealings with Bunyoro. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, this was not the only colonial health blunder in Bunyoro. In 1906, a Colonel Lambkin was brought to Bunyoro to do a health assessment of the people. He did his assessment, and after 6 weeks, concluded that there was a syphilis epidemic. How did he arrive at this conclusion, I wonder? For the longest time, the way to test for syphilis was by using the Wassermann test. The thing about this test, though, is that it also shows positive for other diseases. So if you have malaria, yaws, or endemic syphilis, yes, there are 2 types of syphilis. The test will show up positive. Our dear Colonel Lambkin said that 80% of people had venereal syphilis. Obviously, this wasn't true since the test couldn't distinguish between venereal syphilis and other diseases. And do you want to hear what his explanation for this was? He said that the native practice of polyandry had created the outbreak. According to Lambkin, aka Lammy, the natives had a custom of giving their wives to male guests to sleep with, like they were food you might offer a guest. Here, would you like some coffee or tea? Would you like hot potatoes or rice? Would you like my second wife or my first wife? Maybe the third? This he got from the Anglican missionary John Roscoe. Nsamba completely refutes this idea and says that Roscoe provided no evidence for his claims. While Roscoe is credited with collecting the history of Bunyoro in his book Kitara, he did get some things wrong like this claim that he made. Lambkin also blamed Bunyoro women for being too loose. This mindset of loose black women with voracious sexual appetites is today called the Jezebel stereotype. It was rampant during that time, and writers would portray black women as unable to control themselves sexually. And in Bunyoro, some colonial doctors did use their jobs as an opportunity to exercise their desires. In one incident, in 1922, a female doctor resigned citing the degrading mass inspection of Bunyoro women. Her boss assured her that this was necessary in order to deal with sickness. Another example of this objectification of native peoples is seen in the photographs of German colonial officer Max Weiss. He was active in what is today mainland Tanzania. Back then it was German East Africa, which included Burundi and Rwanda. This man took photos of naked women under the guise of an anthropological study. Anyone who looks at those pictures will recognize them for what they are: sexual exploitation. You can practically feel the discomfort of the subjects jumping off the page or the photograph. And it is made even worse when you learn how he got them in front of the camera. Max Weiss had a violent reputation, and the natives were fully aware of the brutal consequences that followed resistance to the Germans. Anyways, getting back to Lambkin. The historian Shane Doyle, on the other hand, said that Lambkin actually blamed it on Christianity. Apparently, missionary work had broken down the systems of patriarchy, which held at bay the female animals with strong passions. What he's getting at here is the fact that Christianity had taught women to demand more equal footing in their marriages. Women began to leave their husbands when they took on second wives. They were also more willing to leave husbands that they didn't like, which was actually not just a Christian byproduct, but also a result of economic independence. Previously, women could divorce their husbands by simply paying back the bride price, which was usually cattle. However, the colonial cash system, coupled with the fact that the cattle numbers had dwindled to unfathomably low numbers, cash became the way to go. And they could acquire that using their own labor. But even with evidence that the colonial system had destabilized marriages in Bunyoro, and that more people were having sex out of wedlock, the syphilis pandemic wasn't real. The colonial administration eventually came to the realization that they had exaggerated the epidemic to epic proportions. Lambkin's report sounded a false health alarm, to which they did absolutely nothing about till after World War I. The funny thing is that the Bunyoro knew how to deal with some of these diseases. They had treated endemic syphilis for centuries using inoculation. Babies were given to the sick to hold, or they were wrapped in blankets of the sick in order to expose them. It's similar to chickenpox parties. But of course, no one was listening to the natives, and their methods of inoculation were deemed ghastly or disgusting. The missionary Catherine Cook dismissed their way of doing things, saying that they were superstition and dirt. And so in 1921, called by God, she embarked on a holy mission to save those pagan savages. Catherine Cook, with her husband, Albert Cook, preached about repentance and turning to God. According to them, the reason for the high number of deaths in Bunyoro was because they were so sinful. The traditional inoculations were the subjects of their sermons, preaching, "Think of the children for God's sakes, the children." The missionaries also contemplated not providing treatment for fear that the people would simply go back to fornicating. Better to let them die than to be complicit in their wicked ways, am I right? Ironically, Albert Cook, her husband, caught syphilis from a native woman. Was it venereal? We don't know. But if it was, that would mean Dr. Preacherman over there was up to no good. Anyways, the pair of them were useless, and so were their hospitals. The death rate was incredibly high, and Bunyoro began to view hospitals not as treatment centers, but as places where people went to die. Consider this belief. They thought that nurses were going to cook their babies. They also believed that doctors were making them sterile on purpose. Which, interestingly, they actually had a point. At the time, mercury was believed to cure syphilis, and the doctors insisted on injecting both willing and non-willing participants or subjects with sometimes a daily dose. Ironically, mercury actually causes stillbirths, miscarriages, and infant mortality. The converts they had soon reverted back to Kubandwa. Some Bunyoro believed that the destruction of their shrines by Europeans and the deportation of Kabalega had angered the spirits. In response, new spirits emerged that were supposed to be powerful enough to alleviate suffering. I talked about this in episode 4, that the Bunyoro created new deities in response to troubled times. The decrease in churchgoers frustrated the missionaries. They had used coercion and bullying in order to suppress the native practices. All their beliefs were deemed witchcraft by 1911. Even the use of herbal remedies was a sign of the occult. They assaulted mediums and incinerated their items. Oh, and did I mention millet? Yeah, the food, millet. Because of its use by spirit mediums, the missionaries discouraged their converts from eating it. This affected the already bad nutrition of the Bunyoro. Small wonder that when you ask Africans what an agent of the devil looks like, chances are what comes to mind is their native religions. This isn't to suggest at all that there were no bad sides to them. Every religion has a good and a bad side. But I must stress this. The spirit possession religion of Kubandra was about community healing and fertility, not devil worship. The demonization of native religions drove them underground and made them increasingly individualistic. Many would secretly visit them in order to alleviate their suffering. Beatty pointed out that they were living double lives, similar to the equatorial African societies that lived in the rainforests. Jan van Sina even called these people cultural schizophrenics, which explains why Perrault pointed out that Bunyoro converts were practicing Christianity out of fear of the white man rather than actual belief. Okay, so we've talked about how the disease outbreak affected Bunyoro. But what exactly caused this? While Bunyoro certainly suffered their own epidemics, it was increased contact with the outside world that made things worse. As trade ramped up between Bunyoro and the Arabs from the coast and the north, this increased disease incidences. Baganda raids into Bunyoro also contributed to the outbreaks. Felkin, the European explorer and doctor, observed that the rates of smallpox always went up after each Buganda raid. During this time, Kabalega was able to handle the disease outbreaks. It was observed that he would order quarantine measures in central Bunyoro as a response. What went wrong was, as I mentioned before, the War of Conquest in the 1890s. And this destabilized the region to the point that they couldn't handle the outbreaks thrown at them. Not to mention poor rainfall in 1894, 1896, 1898, and 1899 made famine even worse than it already was due to the scorched earth being employed. The lack of proper nutrition lowered their body's abilities to fight disease. These are just a few things that the Bunyoro suffered at the hands of the colonial government. Other things include overtaxation, forced labor, lack of protection from wild animals that would destroy their farms and kill them. The government prioritized the protection of animals over humans. Due to the War of Conquest, low numbers of humans on the land meant less impact on the environment. As such, the numbers of wild animals increased. The people lived in fear of lions, elephants, buffaloes, and baboons, not only because of the threat of a physical attack, but because they also ate or damaged their crops. It turns out that elephants really love them some banana leaves. It was actually stated that some Bunyoro had practically given up trying to grow anything at all. If your crops were going to be eaten anyways, why try? Why bother? Others took to growing smaller crops in the hopes of them not attracting the attention of elephants. Some packed up and left for more well-protected provinces such as Buganda, Nkore, Toro, or any of the others. Now, I'm sure you were wondering yourself why the Bunyoro didn't just kill them. To that, they did try. Thing is, the colonial government made it abundantly clear that any attack on the elephants was a crime. Couldn't they have done it behind their backs, you ask? Yeah, they could. But what made the process difficult was that the government had removed their ability to deal with them. For instance, they had been disarmed and thus couldn't use guns to hunt. The colonial administrator, Harry Johnston, believed that if the Bunyoro were armed, they would not just use them to rebel, but just go about murdering elephants simply for the sake of it. Because that's something that they did, apparently. But fear not, the Bunyoro actually found a way to go around that, because they were actually masters of hunting and trapping. Yeah, but unfortunately, the colonial government cracked down on that because they believed that those methods were exceptionally cruel, even though they were actually more effective than using guns when it came to protecting their crops. What is interesting to note is that they did agree that there needed to be a culling of wild animals. Well, some agreed. Others didn't. Other officials like Governor Jackson believed that the natives were exaggerating the numbers of elephants, which is an opinion that he arrived at from his tours of roadside Uganda. He would simply travel alongside the road and conclude, "Oh, I don't see that many elephants," and then quickly retreat to his comfortable home in Entebbe. He also believed that Uganda had no real hunting tribes. Not sure where he got that from. Clearly didn't know what he was talking about. But the administration could not bring themselves to trust and empower the natives. Instead, the solution was to have them to try and scare away the animals, using drums or lighting fires, and if that didn't work, they had to go and get their chief, who would then have to go and fetch the nearest civil officer to then come shoot the animal. I want you all to remember that this was a time with no telephones and no cars. By the time the civil officer arrived, it would have been too late. It wasn't until 1926 that the colonial government actually agreed that the elephants would need to be restricted to reserves. Any that left the confines of those reserves would be shot by the game department. This actually began to make a difference. Now that I've given you a rundown of the many things affecting Bunyoro during the colonial era, I'd like to go back to the early 1900s, because it was around this time that the Bunyoro began to plan what would become the Nyangere Rebellion in 1907. This rebellion is unique in the sense that it was executed with very little bloodshed. If you tend to think of your rebellions as coming with a side of fighting, this isn't it. But don't get it twisted. Just because it wasn't an armed rebellion doesn't mean that the passion and anger behind it was any less than others in the world. The Bunyoro opted to plan and scheme in secret. The question on their minds was, how do you rebel after having been defeated the first time? After the defeat of the Bunyoro, they gave up hope. They had lost the war, their king was exiled, they suffered famine and disease outbreaks. There was a lot going on. And it was because of this that the attempts by the British to set up a colonial administration had failed. Many even refused to work to earn money for food. They chose instead to eat wild fruits and roots. The British assumed that this was the nature of the Bunyoro. They were lazy, indolent, unintelligent, and oblivious to the benefits of money. They were very harsh in their descriptions. But what they didn't understand is that this was deliberate. It never occurred to them that this was a form of a silent resistance. Historian Yolamu Nsamba, on the other hand, tells us that this was actually a state of mourning called kugaragara. It involves voluntary or self-imposed silence after violent experiences. David Schoenbrunn discusses this act amid the transition of power from the Batrezi dynasty to the Babito in the 16th century. When you consider that the British had militarily occupied their country and were now trying to upend their way of life, you see where they were coming from. The government began to demand taxes such as the hut and gun tax. While the intention was to use the money to develop the state, that is not how it appeared to the Bunyoro. As historian Gian Uzoigwe explains, to tax an African during that time was to emphasize your power to him. Africans paid tax to the king because they respected him and acknowledged his power over them. Consequently, the Bunyoro were less than interested in partaking in their system. In order to gain control of the people, the British tried to use Kabalega's son Kitahimbwa, who they had installed as king in 1898 when he was just 11 years old. But here again arose another problem. First, the British saw him as a puppet, a fact that very much worried the people and dimmed their confidence in him. Second, because the British saw the young Kitahimbwa as a puppet, they did not respect him in the least. An example is when the colonial government gave instructions to remind the king that he had best stay in line, or else he would be exiled like his father. Such an act, among many, would anger a highly monarchical people like the Bunyoro. To them, he wasn't just a king. He was a representation of an institution that dated all the way back to their ancestors. Kitahimbwa seemed to be getting on fine with the government until he wasn't. Little by little, the young man began to demonstrate his father's defiance. He started to demand that his father's servants now be his servants, a request which was quickly shut down. Then he demanded that the lost counties be given back. This This was taking it too far. The British were not at all keen on giving Kitahimba the privileges and powers that came along with actually being a king. Spire, the collector for Bunyoro during those times, wrote that, open quotes, "The young king doesn't seem to realize that the position of the king of Bunyoro to be a very different matter nowadays." Close quotes. By 1902, the young king was deposed for incompetence, which sounded a hell of a lot better than insubordination. The last thing they wanted to do was for their people to know that their king was refusing to obey the government and thereby incite rebellion. On that matter, the British didn't need any help, because the previous year in 1901, they had concluded that the Bunyoro were incapable of governing themselves. So, their solution to this was, wait for it, bring in the Baganda to show them how it's done. They just couldn't help themselves. They really, really couldn't help themselves. In case you've forgotten who the Baganda were, let me remind you. They were their neighbors, their rivals. These two competed for resources and territory for centuries. The Bunyoro claim that Buganda was once part of their mighty empire of Kitara. These are the people who the British brought in to teach the Bunyoro how to rule. Can you imagine how humiliating it was for them? You do remember that in 1894, Kabalega said that he would accept the overlordship of the British, but under no circumstances would he ever accept that of Buganda. And here they were doing this. European imperialism was one thing, but double imperialism? That was something else entirely. They were not having it. They were not having it, oh. I've already talked about why Buganda was allowed to do such things. The British were in awe of the Buganda. It's why George Wilson ordered this act. He believed that Buganda's political system was the only one effective for, quote-unquote, this class of native. He did this despite the warning of the Special Commissioner Harry Johnston, who admittedly did not like the Bunyoro himself, that no one knows better than yourself how much the Buganda and Bunyoro dislike each other. In order to handle this change of rulership, the British colonial government brought in a Muganda by the name of James Mystique. Not of his own free will, might I add. Well, at least according to him. He said that he was threatened with losing his government job in Buganda if he didn't comply. And you guys know how good that government money is. So he goes to work and divides Bunyoro using the Buganda system of governance. He also brings on a significant number of Buganda chiefs. And oh man, as you might have guessed, the Bunyoro were not happy. They had a long list of complaints. They didn't like the new system. They hated their new king. At the time, the British had replaced Kitahimba with his older brother Duhaga Anderea Bisereko. Unlike his younger brother, Duhaga was more amenable. He was reportedly a great fan of James Mystique. It's because of this over-friendliness with the government that some Bunyoro did not trust him. Some even plotted his overthrow, accusing him of giving away their kingdom to the Baganda. Whereas others simply supported him because he was Kabalega's son. The issue of land was also front and center. The Bunyoro accused the Baganda chiefs of having taken land for themselves. They also said that whatever profits were being reaped from the land were simply being taken to Buganda as opposed to being invested in the kingdom. Trade in Bunyoro was almost entirely owned by the Baganda. To top it off, they were also accused of being violent, which wasn't just of a physical nature, but also of a cultural one. Because some Baganda chiefs took it a step further by deciding that they needed to make Bunyoro subjects Baganda. How did they do this? Well, they did this by encouraging them to speak Luganda, which for those who don't know is the language of the Baganda. And they would accomplish that in two ways. One, making Luganda the language of the church in Bunyoro. The church was very central in education in Uganda at the time, and actually still is. Two, making it the language of the Bunyoro district. A missionary noted that at the time, the Baganda chiefs believed that if they could get the Bunyoro to speak Luganda, they would technically be under the rule of the kingdom of Buganda. and they were already aided in this cause by the missionaries who were more in favor of translating the Bible to Luganda rather than Bunyoro, thus ensuring that the only way for a Bunyoro to read the Bible was by either learning English or Luganda. So soon, the heat of rebellion began to rise. The Bunyoro began to snap out of their self-imposed state of mourning, and the walls of resistance began to be raised. In 1904, they rebelled against their Baganda chiefs, and finally the government decided to listen to what they had to say. George Wilson went out to hear their grievances, but ultimately nothing was done about it. 2 years pass. It's January 1907. Two Bunyoro, by the names of Petero and Zabuloni, are sent as emissaries to the neighboring kingdoms by their chiefs. Petero was sent to Busoga, while Zabuloni was sent to Nkore and Toro. I should note that what I'm about to talk about is unconfirmed, but it was widely reported that this is how things went down. The goal of this correspondence was to determine how these kingdoms felt about having Baganda in their territory. If they were unhappy with the way things were, the emissaries would then move to secure their support in their plot to oust the Baganda. It turned out that none of these kingdoms were happy with the status quo, given that they too had Baganda ways and chiefs imposed on them. This had naturally created resentment among them. So a plan was formulated. Bunyoro had just established that Toro, Nkore, and Busoga were also unhappy with having Baganda chiefs. Bunyoro would secure a multi-kingdom conference during which they would bring up the subject of removing Baganda chiefs. If they got their wish, the others would also bring up the matter since the precedent had already been set. This way, they could pressure the government into removing Baganda from not just their territory, but the others as well. This might seem like a roundabout way of doing things, actually considering that they had multiple opportunities to air out their grievances to the government. In fact, every Wednesday, the colonial government would hold what was called a baraza. Think of it as like a town hall meeting. And at this baraza, their concerns would be heard. However, these meetings were not multinational. So the Bunyoro figured if it was multinational and the others sided with them, they would be able to achieve their goal. A key part of this whole plan was for it to seem spontaneous, like they hadn't been planning this the whole time. Such an act would have been seen as rebellion, which it was, and it would have been dismissed summarily. And there's no need for confrontation when you can manipulate to get what you want. So I mentioned that this whole plan might have been a rumor, but it doesn't matter. Because either way, the Bunyoro were able to gain support of the other kingdoms of Toro, Nkore, and Busoga. Remember how I said that their king Dohaga was not well liked? Well, he wasn't informed of the upcoming insurrection until January 1907. Apparently, he was in favor of it, but would not risk exposing himself by bringing up the issue of the Baganda chiefs. So he, claimed that he was sick and had his chiefs take up the request with the district commissioner, Mr. Cubitt. However, Mr. Cubitt refused to listen to them, citing that they should use the proper channels, which would have been their king, who, as I mentioned, was supposedly indisposed due to illness. The Bunyoro saw no other option but to bring up the matter of removing the Baganda directly with Mr. Cubitt at the next baraza. And you can imagine his confoundment at the whole affair. The colonial government apparently had no idea that the Bunyoro wanted the Baganda removed. Sure, they were dissatisfied, but removal? Nicodem, a former Murusura who was fearless, spoke on behalf of the people. The crowd was ignited by this and offered their support. Historian Uzoigwe wrote that the people were openly condemning the British for imposing Baganda chiefs on them. And this is when the Bunyoro began to show their hand, revealing who their true target was. Hint, it wasn't entirely about the Baganda. Mr. Cubitt, the district commissioner, dismissed the whole affair as insignificant, but he did decide to report to Entebbe. Nothing was done, though. This meeting was the fall of the first domino, because from then on, the local people took an interest in this open rebellion. And that's how it starts. It only takes one person to say something before several people start coming up saying, I know, right? He did this and did that. So on February 5th, 1907, another baraza was held. This time, there were even more people that showed up. A young Bunyoro clerk called Isaiah Bikundi wrote that people from all corners of Bunyoro came. Leading the charge this time was a man named Byabatrezi, who was a former Mrusra general turned collaborator. He demanded the removal of the Baganda chiefs. And he is an interesting character. He's usually remembered as a traitor by Bunyoro, and that's because, as I mentioned, he collaborated with the British. This earned him the ire of the others. But even he was too dissatisfied with the whole situation that he couldn't afford to be silent anymore. At that moment, Byabatrezi was revealed to be part of this whole affair. He was seen as the ringleader of the rebellion even though he didn't start it. He was brought on a bit later. Now, Mr. Cubit shut this whole thing down. He refused to listen to anything that the people or Byabatrezi had to say, unless the king and his Saza chiefs were present. Because, as he said before, proper channels. I'm holding air quotes. This only served to make the situation even worse, as the Bunyoro now became outright rebellious. There was no hiding it anymore. So do you remember James Mati, the Muganda who divided Bunyoro into a new system of administration? Well, he was summoned back to Bunyoro to handle things, to which he said no, in a cool and professional manner. He argued that it actually wasn't his problem to deal with, but rather the government's, which he was right. And plus, his presence would have just made things worse. On February 21st, 1907, Mr. Cubit, aka Proper Channels, called a huge baraza. Every Bunyoro was said to be present, including the king Ndoleriire Bisereko and his chiefs. Ndoleriire is also known as Duhaga, by the way. For some reason, the lower chiefs, along with a Mubito prince, did all the talking. The big chiefs and the king were silent. I guess this was their way of saying, I can neither confirm nor deny that I'm involved in this. Which they all were. But they weren't about to admit that. They were caught between two fires. If they sided with their British overlords, they would lose respect in the eyes of their people. However, if they sided with their own people, that was rebellion. So, given his options, do you want to guess what our dear king picked out? Ultimately, he decided to side with the British. Duhaga claimed that he had nothing to do with the demands that his people were making. Basically, he poured gasoline on the fire. His people felt betrayed and were outraged at his words. They became openly belligerent. In an effort to calm the situation, Cubit promised to forward the matter to the governor. But the people were unconvinced and threatened to throw out all the Baganda from their territory. For the next 5 months, Bunyoro made the lives of Baganda in their country miserable. They would arrest and convict them on made-up charges. They would slash their crops and burn their huts in defiance. Eventually, this escalated to running them off their estates. The Baganda retreated to Bunyoro's capital, Hoima, for protection. This whole time, they were asking the government to allow them to return home, but they refused. In April of that year, 1907, the colonial government sent an administrator called Mr. Tompkins. He was already familiar with Bunyoro, so they had confidence in his ability to mediate the situation. He was told the same thing that Mr. Cubit was told, and strongly urged the government not to put any more Baganda chiefs in charge, those holding positions currently. He recommended that they be replaced as soon as the opportunity arose. However, neither party liked this recommendation. The Bunyoro wanted the Baganda gone post-haste, while the British didn't like giving in to their demands. By May, Cubit was replaced by a Mr. Eden, with strict instructions to reinstate the chased-out Baganda chiefs and remind the Bunyoro that they were under the rulership of the British. So, Eden went to work and called a huge baraza, pulled out the pamphlet or document, and read the orders out loud to the public. It was at this meeting that the rebellion got its name, because out of the crowd people started shouting, Nyangire, which means, I have refused. In other words, no. Bunyoro chiefs made it clear to Eden that they would not be responsible for the safety of the Baganda chiefs if they returned. The British had effectively lost control of the situation. Every attempt by Eden to get them to comply was rebuffed. They were at a loss. Not to mention, the colonial government wasn't sure if this was really a rebellion. The people weren't using physical violence, they had just refused to obey orders. Are they contemplating an armed rebellion? Should we send the military? These were questions that they were sending back and forth through telegrams. They also believed that this was only about removing the Baganda. But let's be real here. Let's be real. Do you really think the Bunyoro forgot who's really in charge? Who killed their people? Who exiled their king? Who burnt their crops and caused a famine? All the bad things that happened to them? I don't think so. This attack on Baganda was actually partially a smokescreen for anti-colonial sentiment. The fastest way for them to be shut down would have been for them to make this about the British. But in order to last a little bit longer, they made it more about the Baganda. But ultimately, by disobeying the British orders to reinstate the Baganda chiefs, they were in a sense expressing their discontent with their colonial masters. The Bunyoro, riding the high of this rebellion, decided to finally put forth their request for a multinational conference. However, the governor wouldn't hear it until his demands had been met. He also stated that if they kept it up, that they wouldn't be allowed to attend the ceremony on Empire Day. Haha. This day was, as you might imagine, a celebration of the British Empire. A day to, open quotes, actually, I'm going to read this in a British accent, in my best British accent. Excuse the butchery. It's a day, open quotes as you might imagine, to remind children that they formed part of the British, no, that's not even a British accent. Open quotes. It was a day to remind children that they formed part of the British Empire and that they might think with others in lands across the sea what it meant to be sons and daughters of such a glorious empire, and that the strength of the empire depended upon them and they must never forget it. Close quotes. How's that? How do you think I did? These were the glory days for Britain. Of course, the Bunyoro felt no such solidarity. In fact, Duhaga and his chiefs declined to attend after the governor had changed his mind about not allowing them to attend. They just said, nah, we're good. The governor was like, yeah, no, but you can come though. Yeah, we're okay. Thank you, though. We appreciate the sentiment. This, as you might imagine, greatly angered the British. It was a clear challenge to their authority. Eden had had enough. He upped military presence in the kingdom. And it was then that the Bunyoro chiefs began to take a step back. They began to reconsider their actions, and they acknowledged that they would carry out the orders to reinstate the Baganda chiefs, but they claimed that it wasn't feasible. They said that they feared for their lives and for those of their underlings, and most especially those of the Baganda chiefs. Mr. Eden was so insulted by their rather transparent attempt to disobey orders. He was so angry with this response that he added even more troops. But this turned out to have the opposite effect of what he had intended. The Bunyoro decided to bare their teeth. Eden, who had held a small baraza meeting, looked out the window only to see Byabachwezi with 300 to 500 Bunyoro, each armed with small knives. To make matters worse, the chiefs with whom he was having this meeting, who had initially agreed to allow the Baganda chiefs to come back, were now going back on their word. This was the final straw. Eden later decided to arrest the chiefs at a meeting that he was going to call. However, word got out, and some of them skipped town. It didn't stop him, though, from going ahead with the meeting. Eden had every intention of showing the Bunyoro who was really in charge. The people were surrounded by the army and the police as they paraded about. They performed military exercises in order to demonstrate their military force. And again, this did not have the intended effect. The Bunyoro chiefs became belligerent and lost their minds with anger. They refused to listen to anything that Eden had to say. Many were even shouting that they would rather die than see such a thing happen. Eden proceeded to arrest 53 of the chiefs present, and the crowd went wild. They too began loudly protesting. People were said to be throwing themselves on the ground, beating the ground, all the while proclaiming that they were ready to die for their cause. Historian Uzoigwe also mentions that there's another version of events. He says that the Omukama, King Duhaga, stood up and denounced his subjects for disobeying him and the government. He also said that the presence of soldiers forced the chiefs to back down. I don't know which one of these is true, or if they were both true. Either way, the arrest of the chiefs was pretty much the end of the Nyangire revolt. Nyangire is a prime example of non-violent resistance. They didn't exactly get what they wanted, but the colonial administration did agree that no more Baganda chiefs would be installed in Bunyoro. Furthermore, they were allowed to report any chiefs who were not up to par, which the Bunyoro took as an opportunity to force Baganda chiefs out. Some were blackmailed into admitting crimes that they didn't commit. They would then be fired and be replaced with a Bunyoro chief. Others actually were guilty. It should be noted that non-violence was chosen not out of some moral high ground, but as the best possible option to advance their cause against a militarily superior opponent. So if you want another example of non-violence other than MLK or Gandhi, there you go. What is fascinating about the story was that few at the time believed that the Bunyoro were capable of orchestrating such a complex plot. Choosing nonviolence, gaining allies, and putting together rational and convincing arguments that the British couldn't, under all circumstances, refute was, as Deputy Commissioner George Wilson put it, quote-unquote, suspicion of non-native guidance. As a matter of fact, it was his belief that the Catholics had put them up to it. They're the ones who organized the whole thing, and the Bunyoro were simply the muscle. His evidence for this was the complaints by the Catholics of the domination of Protestants in the Bunyoro local government. As such, they eventually supported the removal of Baganda chiefs who were largely Protestant. However, they did withdraw their support when the movement became too big. There was a genuine lack of understanding of the motivations of the entire situation. Some members of the Anglican Church Missionary Society believed that the movement was anti-Christian, anti-European, and anti-progressive. Others, like James Beattie and Fisher, blamed the Batoro. Beattie believed that the Batoro had upset our Bunyoro country. This was because they had supported a Bunyoro to Rutoro translation of the Bible. If I hadn't mentioned this before, the Bunyoro and the Batoro are very similar. Even their languages are very similar. So it makes sense that they would support a Bunyoro to Rutoro translation as opposed to a Luganda translation. And as I mentioned before, the only language that the missionaries were interested in translating the Bible to was Luganda. In any case, the Bunyoro had to be punished for this act of insurrection. And so George Wilson rode out on a horse, to Hoima, the capital of Bunyoro, in order to hand out personally their penalties. Biabatrezi, the supposed ringleader, lost his rank as a Saza chief and subsequently suffered a reduction in salary. He was also made to hand over a third of his estates to the Omukama, the king, and pay a fine of 7,500 rupees over a period of 3 years. I'm not sure how much that amounts to today, but it was a substantial amount for the time and in Uganda. As for the other chiefs, some were deposed. Others were detained in Buganda for 6 months, and the rest exiled to Kenya for 3 years. Some were exiled never to be seen again. The end of the Nyangere Rebellion did not conclude the Lost Counties affair. The Bunyoro still brought it up with their government. At the time, British officials were less than interested in hearing about their claims. But that all began to change in 1924, when a new king of Bunyoro was crowned. His name was Omukama Tito Winyi. His coronation was to mark a new beginning for Bunyoro and the colonial government. Governor Geoffrey Archer of Uganda announced that the policy of discrimination and exclusion was now over. The British government would work hand in hand with Bunyoro in order to restore it to its proper position. This was a time when the British cared more about management than domination. They were more than okay with leaving control to local leaders. In other words, indirect rule. This view was also helped by the fact that Bunyoro soldiers had fought for Great Britain in the First World War. The government and the missionaries began to let go of their biases against the Bunyoro. It was an olive branch that the Bunyoro reached out for. I was going to say wholeheartedly, but they never really trusted them. They did, however, feel that they had a better chance of getting the lost counties. So they went to work, convincing them that all kings in Uganda had descended from Bunyoro. They were the inheritors of the Kitara Empire. And this is where the doctored king lists come into play. If you listen to the 4th episode, I did mention that Christopher Wrigley, the historian, criticized them for this. The king lists were falsified to cement their claims. However, I also mentioned that this attempt to convince their overlords of their ancient superiority was also undertaken by the Baganda. And so you have both sides trying to outmaneuver each other. David Hennigy argues that since both sides used to be illiterate societies, they didn't tend to put things into lists. Instead, he believes that they used past kings more as reference points for remembering historical information. For instance, in the time of King so-and-so, we were happy and life was good. But determining when King so-and-so ruled becomes much more difficult when they are not of the recent past. Thus he doubted the entire claim of a vast Kitara empire, let alone that the Bunyoro themselves were descended from some medieval group. Which is an interesting analysis. While it is difficult to prove the existence of Kitara, it is a fact that many groups in the Interlacustrine region, including the Baganda, claim to have descended from Bunyoro. Or at least in Buganda's case, it is one of their origin stories. The Bunyoro used this line of reasoning in order to hammer home how much they had lost. And soon, Bunyoro began to win over the hearts of British officials. Eventually, they accepted the pre-colonial dominance of Bunyoro, and in 1933, it was recognized as Bunyoro-Kitara, a throwback to the legendary empire. Having said that, they refused to give back the lost counties. The reason for this was that while Bunyoro was morally owed those counties, Buganda was not at all willing to negotiate a transfer of ownership. If they did twist Buganda's arm and force them to relinquish those lands, that would cause unrest among the Baganda. So the colonial government picked the lesser of bad options. They could handle Bunyoro's constant badgering, but were not at all willing to antagonize the Baganda. Of course, this would not fly. Omukama Winyi argued that the British had talked a big game about indirect rule, but were actually not implementing it. So Winyi was asking, if the policy was indirect rule, right? Why did that apply to every other kingdom except them? Why weren't they allowed to rule over the lost counties which were rightfully theirs? Bunyoro continued their assault of questioning on the colonial government by arguing that Uganda had accepted their protection from slavery. But doesn't a refusal to return the lost counties amount to a form of slavery? A withholding of the freedoms of Bunyoro in those counties? Being forced to capitulate to the kingship of Buganda? It was a very pointed attack, aimed straight at the heart of the identity of the British Empire. They likened themselves to liberators and bringers of civilization, champions of morality and justice. As convincing as these arguments were, it wouldn't be enough. And as times changed and World War II began, the British went back to direct control. Historian Shane Doyle tells us that this was the era of 5-year plans and democratic local governments, and as such, Bunyoro's insistence on restoration to the old days was seen as an impediment to modernization. After all, Bunyoro in the past was far from democratic. Consequently, they came to be called a banana boat and a dead-end district, a place where the careers of administrators went to die. British officials had grown tired of the issue of the lost counties. They secretly called them a race of political gasbags. Others, like Buganda historians Kiwanuka and Mutibwa, said that their claims were signs of their backwardness and self-defeating nostalgia. Matthias Kiwanuka himself wrote a convincingly well-worded essay calling the Empire of Kitara a myth. But as harsh as those words were, they did have a point. Bunyoro had prioritized getting back the lost counties over modernization, over moving forward, and it cost them. Bunyoro was the poorest district in Uganda at the time, being far outpaced by the others. This focus on nostalgia, though, was not felt by everyone. There were some educated Bunyoro who wanted to shift the focus to making the kingdom better. However, Winyi was accused of blocking their attempts. He would fire any one of those who didn't agree with him and replace them with less educated people. Some even bought their way in. Winyi accepted this primarily because the district was poor, not that it excuses his actions. Furthermore, the chiefs chosen were not close to their people like they used to be in the past. They were brutal as a result of colonial demands. There was less distribution of wealth, which traditionally was seen as something that the king and his chiefs did for his people. An example was that the king no longer threw feasts. Instead, it was just take, and take. He had become too powerful, and many bemoaned the stagnation of affairs. People mentioned that it took forever to get anything done. This would have been an opportunity to make the country better, but instead, the lost counties took precedence. Interestingly, even after the Bunyoro who wanted to do things differently were able to reduce Winyi's powers in 1955, they too ended up focusing on the lost counties. Yeah, their story is one of loss and defeat. If the situations were flipped, I doubt that the Buganda would let that go so easily. Neither would England. And you can see this with many groups around the world who lost to an incoming group, whether it's the Aboriginals in Australia, or the Americas, or the Palestinians in Israel. The lost counties were a point of pride for the Bunyoro. The lands contained the grave sites of their previous rulers. They even said that it made up the core of their kingdom. By the 1950s, Bunyoro had diversified its approach to get back these counties. Winyi worked hard to get a Bunyoro elected to the Uganda Legislative Council. The hope was that they could better fight for the restoration of the counties. They even hired legal advisors in London to prove the illegality of the land transfer. All this, though, was still not enough. Finally, Bunyoro in those counties were pushed to the edge. In 1960, they began engaging in boycotts, arson, and violence against Buganda chiefs. A major cause for this was the feeling that independence would come before the matter was resolved. After all, it was the time that Great Britain was relinquishing control of their territories. India had gotten independence, Ghana had got independence. Times were changing. These brazen acts pushed the Uganda Relationships Commission to investigate because their aim was to make sure that Uganda would gain independence as one country. They suggested that the referendum be held in the lost counties, and they can vote where they want it to be, either back with Bunyoro or with Buganda. While this is an excellent recommendation, the Colonial Secretary, Ian McLeod, was fearful of Buganda reprisals. The Lost Counties issue became one of national politics. The Uganda People's Congress, a political party led by Milton Obote, the future first prime minister, supported Bunyoro's claim. However, that all went out the window when he realized that he couldn't support them and have the support of the Buganda Nationalist Political Party known as Kabaka Yeka. Kabaka Yeka means the Kabaka, the king alone. because as it turns out, he needed them to defeat the Democratic Party. So they agreed to not hold a referendum before independence, at least officially. The Kabaka Party hoped, unofficially, that they would never, ever get to that. On October 9th, 1962, Uganda finally gained its independence from Great Britain. 2 years later, Obote broke the alliance when he decided that the referendum could go ahead. This resulted in an angry split between the two parties, and subsequently, Bunyoro got back 2 of the 6 lost counties. Interestingly, the split between Obote's UPC party and Kabaka led to his abolishing of all kingdoms in Uganda in 1967. He was reportedly afraid of a coup from Buganda. That way, he not only managed to cripple Buganda, but the others as well in case they got any ideas. No more traditional institutions for people to rally behind. Just him with absolute power. All their hard work for the last 60 years vanished at that moment. For the next 26 years, Ugandans operated without the traditional institutions that had been so central to their lives for the past centuries. This was rectified in 1993 when the current president, Museveni, brought them back. Today, the once mighty empire of Bunyoro is a cultural institution. It has no political powers and exists solely to remind people of their cultural ties. Anyways, that is all I have for today, everyone. I appreciate you all for listening. This is only the beginning for me. I'm still not quite done with Bunyoro yet. There's still a few topics that I would like to discuss in relation to their society, but after that, my plan is to tackle Buganda. So, stay tuned, stay educated, and let's continue bringing African history to light. My name is David Ibanda, and thank you for listening to the Those Who Came Before Us podcast.